My adoptive parents are local heroes for fostering troubled kids. I committed a felony to get arrested just to prove they are monsters, but now everyone thinks I'm the monster. If you had turned on the local news last fall, you probably would have seen them. My parents, David and Carol. They were the lead story on the evening segment about local heroes. The camera panned across our perfectly manicured lawn, the charming two-story house with the welcoming front porch. The reporter's voice was warm, full of admiration. She called them the Saints of Maple Street, a couple who had opened their home and their hearts to over 20 at-risk youths over the past decade. The footage showed them at a charity drive, smiling, surrounded by grateful neighbors. It showed them handing out cookies at a bake sale. It showed our home, a perfect picture of warmth and stability. And then, the camera turned to me. I was sitting on the porch swing, staring at the ground. The reporter's voiceover explained that I was their eldest, the one who tested them, the one with the rebellious phase. My therapist had used those exact words in our last family session, her voice full of gentle praise for my parents. "David, Carol," she'd said, "your patience with Chloe is truly remarkable." My teachers said it. My neighbors whispered it. Everyone in our town knew the story. David and Carol were saints, and I was their beautiful, troubled cross to bear. They had no idea what happened when the cameras were off, when the neighbors went home, when the doors were locked. On the outside, we were the perfect family, a testament to the power of love and patience. On the inside, our home was a silent prison, and I was the only one who remembered the sound of the locks clicking shut. I had tried to tell people, of course, but every attempt just added another layer to the story of the difficult child. I was just acting out, they'd say, looking for attention, ungrateful. After a while, I stopped trying. I learned to play my part in their perfect little show. But everything changed the day they brought Leo home. He was 8 years old, with big, terrified eyes and a silence that felt heavier than my own. And when I looked at him, I saw myself, 9 years earlier, standing in that same doorway, believing I had finally found a safe place. I knew I couldn't let him go through what I went through. The perfect family, the saints of Maple Street. Their story was about to come to an end. I was going to make sure of it. The abuse in our house wasn't the kind that left bruises. It was quieter, cleaner, the kind that left scars on the inside where no one could see them. Carol's favorite form of discipline was the quiet room. It was a small windowless room in the basement that she and David had soundproofed themselves. Forgetting. To make your bed, talking back, getting a B on a math test, any minor infraction could earn you a few hours in the dark, silent cold. I spent my 13th birthday in there because I'd been sullen at the dinner table. David's method was more sophisticated. He called it emotional re-education. He'd sit you down in his pristine office, surrounded by his books on child psychology, and make you write in a confession journal. You'd have to write down your bad thoughts, your negative feelings, over and over, until your confession matched the narrative he wanted. I once had to write, "I am grateful for my loving family," 500 times because I'd said I missed my old foster home. When Leo arrived, I saw the same pattern begin. He was a sweet, scared kid who had been through enough already. But in our house, his trauma was just another opportunity for them to practice their parenting. 2 weeks after he moved in, I tried to tell my school counselor, Mrs. Albright. I told her about the quiet room, about the journals. She just smiled, this gentle, pitying smile. "Chloe," she said, her voice soft, "it sounds like you're using metaphors to express a feeling of being unheard." I didn't know what to say. They weren't metaphors. They were real. She told me she was proud of me for opening up, and that she would call my parents to let them know I was making progress. My heart dropped. I knew what was coming. That night, David and Carol sat me down on the living room couch. The same couch where they filmed their interviews about being local heroes. David's voice was calm, therapeutic, the same voice he used during his re-education sessions. "Chloe," he began, his face a perfect mask of concern. "Mrs. Albright called us. She told us about your fantasies." Carol sat beside him, nodding, her expression one of deep, sorrowful disappointment. "We know you're struggling," David continued, "and we want to help you. But these stories, they are hurting the family. They're hurting our ability to help other children, like Leo." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "If this continues," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "We may have to consider more intensive treatment for you." The threat hung there in the air between us, unspoken but crystal clear. A special school, a residential treatment facility, a place they could send the difficult child, a place where no one would ever listen to her stories again. I just sat there, my hands clenched into fists in my lap, and I nodded. I agreed to stop. I agreed to be better. I played my part. But as I walked back to my room that night, I knew that staying silent was no longer an option. They weren't just hurting me anymore. They were hurting Leo, and I was the only one who could stop them. I just had to figure out how. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night. I woke up to a sound, a small, terrified whimper coming from Leo's room. I crept down the hallway and saw him standing by his bed, his pajamas soaked, tears streaming down his face. He'd had a nightmare and wet the bed. My heart ached for him. But before I could comfort him, Carol was there. Her face was a cold, hard mask. Without a word, she grabbed his small arm and led him downstairs. I heard the click of the basement door, then the heavier, more final sound of the bolt sliding into place on the quiet room door. Hygiene isolation, she'd call it. I waited until I heard her go back to her bedroom, then I crept down to the basement. I pressed my ear against the cold metal door of the quiet room. I could hear him inside, his small, muffled sobs echoing in the soundproofed space. He was calling for his mom. He was calling for help. But no one was coming. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening to him cry, my own tears hot on my cheeks. The helplessness was a physical weight crushing me. The next morning, I confronted them. I found David in his office, reading. "You can't do that to him," I said, my voice shaking with a rage I couldn't control. "He's just a little boy." He was scared. David looked up from his book, his expression one of calm, patient disappointment. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Chloe," he began, his voice the epitome of therapeutic calm, "Leo has deep-seated trauma related to neglect. What you see as punishment is actually a firm, structured boundary. It's a therapeutic technique to help him understand cause and effect, to help him heal." He used all the right words: therapeutic, structured, boundaries. He was a master of turning abuse into a treatment plan. He twisted my concern into a sign of my own unresolved issues. I left his office feeling sick. Later that day, I found Leo's confession journal sitting on the hall table, waiting for David's review. I opened it. Page after page was filled with Leo's clumsy, childish handwriting. And on every line, the same sentence written over and over. "I am unclean and I must be purified." He'd been forced to write it 100 times. That was his emotional re-education. I looked out the window and saw Leo in the backyard, sitting alone on the swing, his small body barely moving. His face was blank, his eyes empty. They were breaking him just like they had tried to break me, and in that moment, something inside me snapped. The part of me that had hoped, that had tried to play by the rules, that had believed that one day, someone would listen. It just died. They had an answer for everything. Every complaint, every cry for help, they twisted it into a symptom of our damage. I realized then that no one would ever listen to my words. My words were meaningless to them, just the ramblings of a troubled girl. I had to scream. I had to scream in a language they couldn't ignore, a language of chaos and consequences that would be too loud for even the saints of Maple Street to dismiss. My plan needed to be loud. It needed to be public, and it needed to be aimed at something so untouchable that the response would be immediate and overwhelming. So I chose my target, the mayor's brand new 6-figure sports car. A gleaming black symbol of power that he parked in a reserved spot right in front of City Hall every single day. Vandalizing that car wasn't just a crime. It was a statement. It was a slap in the face to the entire establishment that had protected my parents and ignored kids like me. I spent a day gathering my tools. A can of bright red spray paint, a crowbar I took from our garage, a black hoodie and a disposable face mask. I felt strangely calm, my hands steady, my purpose clear. This wasn't an act of teenage rebellion. This was a calculated sacrifice. I was trading my future for Leo's, for all the kids who came before him, for all the ones who might come after. I waited until 1 p.m. the next day, right when the lunch rush was at its peak. The square in front of City Hall was crowded. I pulled up my hood, put on my mask, and walked straight to the car. My heart was pounding, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, but I didn't hesitate. The spray paint hissed as I wrote the words in huge, jagged letters across the driver's side door. They hurt us. 2 words. A desperate, anonymous scream for help. People were stopping now, staring, pulling out their phones. I could hear their murmurs, their shocked gasps. But I wasn't done. I took out the crowbar. The first blow against the windshield was deafening, the sound of shattering glass echoing across the square. I hit it again and again, the safety glass splintering into a spiderweb of cracks. Then I moved to the headlights, smashing each one with a cold, methodical precision. I didn't run. That was the most important part of the plan. I just stood there, crowbar in hand, breathing heavily, and waited. The siren started almost immediately. Within minutes, the square was swarming with police. I saw them coming, saw the shock and anger on their faces. I dropped the crowbar and put my hands up. An officer tackled me to the ground, his knee pressing hard into my back, the rough pavement scraping against my cheek. I could hear people shouting, cameras flashing. As they pulled me to my feet and shoved me into the back of a police car, my eyes scanned the crowd. And I saw them, the news vans. Their cameras were pointed right at me. The whole city, the whole state would see this. They would have to ask why. They would have to listen. My parents would see me as a monster, a criminal, a disgrace. But in the back of that police car, with my hands cuffed behind my back and the sirens wailing around me, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had finally screamed loud enough. Now, I just had to pray that the right person would hear me. The interrogation room was exactly like you see in the movies. Small, gray, and smelling faintly of stale sweat and regret. I sat at a metal table, my hands cuffed in front of me, and I just stared at the wall. The local cops had tried for an hour to get me to talk. They'd been aggressive, then friendly, then threatening. I didn't say a word. Silence was the only power I had left. Then the door opened and my parents walked in. And their performance? It was breathtaking. Carol rushed to my side, her face a perfect mask of maternal anguish, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Oh, Chloe, my baby," she sobbed. "What have you done?" David stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, his expression one of deep, sorrowful confusion. "We don't know what's gotten into her, officer," he said to the cop standing in the doorway, his voice thick with fake emotion. "She's been struggling so much since we adopted her. We've had her in therapy, we've tried everything." He was planting the seed, building the narrative. I wasn't a whistleblower. I was a broken, troubled kid lashing out. And it was working. I could see it in the officer's eyes. The pity, the dismissal. They assigned me a public defender, a tired-looking man who smelled like old coffee. He told me the evidence was overwhelming and that my best bet was to plead guilty, apologize, and hope for leniency. "Just tell them what they want to hear," he advised. "Tell them you were angry, that you made a mistake." I looked at him, at this man who was supposed to be on my side, and I shook my head. I refused to speak. This wasn't about the car. It was about Leo. It was about all of them. The stalemate lasted for another hour. Finally, the door opened again, and a new man walked in. He was older, with a weathered face and eyes that looked like they had seen everything. He wasn't a local cop. He introduced himself as Detective Harding from the state's Juvenile Crimes Unit. He didn't sit down. He just stood there studying me, his expression unreadable. "You've caused a lot of trouble, kid," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Vandalizing the mayor's car? That's a felony. You're looking at serious time?" This was it. My one shot. I finally lifted my head, my neck stiff from hours of staring at the floor. I looked him dead in the eyes, and for the first time since my arrest, I spoke. "Turn on your recorder," I said, my voice hoarse but steady. Harding raised an eyebrow. "I'm not a vandal," I continued, my voice getting stronger with every word. "I'm a whistleblower. And this?" I gestured to the handcuffs, to the gray room, to the whole pathetic scene. This was the only way you would ever listen. Harding stared at me for a long, silent moment. I could see him weighing his options, trying to decide if I was a delusional kid or something else entirely. I held his gaze, refusing to look away. I had gambled everything on this moment, on this one person being willing to look past the obvious and see the truth. All he had to do was press record. Detective Harding sat down. He pulled out a small digital recorder and placed it on the metal table between us. The small red light blinked on, a silent promise that I was finally being heard. So I talked. For 2 straight hours, I told him everything. I started with the day I arrived at their house, a scared 9-year-old who thought she'd found her forever home. And then, I walked him through the slow, creeping reality of what that home really was. I told him about the quiet room. I described the soundproofing foam on the walls, the heavy steel door with the bolt on the outside, the chilling, absolute silence when you were locked inside. I told him the spare key was hidden in a hollowed-out book in David's office, a psychology textbook titled The Resilient Child. The irony was so bitter it almost made me laugh. I told him about the confession journals. I described David's office, the oak bookshelf where he kept them, all lined up in neat alphabetical order by child's name. Leo's will be the newest one, I said, my voice barely a whisper. It's a blue spiral notebook. Look for the page where he had to write, "I am unclean," 100 times. I saw a flicker of something in Harding's eyes. A crack in his professional mask, but he just kept writing. His pen scratching against the paper. I gave him names. The names of 3 other foster kids older than me who had been in the house and then just disappeared. One was sent to a specialty boarding school in another state. Another supposedly ran away. The third was sent back to the system after being labeled unmanageable. I told Harding, they all tried to talk. They all tried to tell someone. And David and Carol made them disappear. When I finally finished, the silence in the room was heavy. Harding sat back in his chair, his face a mixture of professional skepticism and something else. Something I couldn't quite read. "You understand the gravity of these accusations," he said, his voice low. "David and Carol are pillars of this community, respected, adored." "I know," I said, my voice steady. "That's their shield. That's why no one has ever listened." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching my face, looking for any sign of a lie, any crack in my story. "The specificity of your claims," he said slowly, "is compelling." He stood up. "I'm going to conduct a preliminary welfare check at the house," he said, "just to check on the other children." He paused at the door, his hand on the knob, and looked back at me. His eyes were hard. "But you need to understand something, kid. If this is a lie, if I go out there and find nothing, you've just turned a vandalism charge into a felony for filing a false report. You'll be spending a long, long time in a place much worse than that quiet room you described." I met his gaze without flinching. "I know," I said. "Go!" My entire future, Leo's future, all of it rested on what he would find, or what my parents had already managed to hide. I later learned what happened during that welfare check from Detective Harding's official report. He arrived at my house and was greeted at the door by David and Carol, their faces a perfect blend of concern and weary patience. They invited him in, offered him coffee, and immediately launched into their performance. "Detective, we are so glad you're here," Carol began, her voice trembling slightly. "We are just sick with worry about Chloe. Her mental state. It's been deteriorating for months." David stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, a stoic, supportive husband. "We love her so much," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But she has these fantasies. We've been trying to get her help, but she resists it." They were brilliant. Harding wrote in his report that for the first 20 minutes, he was almost completely convinced. They were the perfect parents, and I was the troubled, lying child. They willingly gave him a tour of the house. He asked to see the basement, and they led him down the stairs without a hint of hesitation. He found himself in a bright, cheerful playroom. Colorful mats on the floor, toys neatly arranged on shelves, a small television playing a cartoon. There was no quiet room, no steel door. Just a smooth, freshly painted wall. "We've been meaning to renovate this space for ages," Carol said with a bright, easy smile. "Make it more welcoming for the little ones." Next, David's office. It was pristine, organized. The bookshelf held psychology textbooks, just as I'd said. But the shelf where I told him the journals were kept was empty. He asked about them, and David just gave him a sad, knowing look. "Chloe's stories can be quite vivid, Detective," he said. "There are no such journals." Harding was ready to leave. He wrote in his report that he was mentally preparing the paperwork to charge me with filing a false report. He was walking towards the front door, my parents following close behind, their performance never wavering. And then he saw it, a detail so small, so insignificant that anyone else would have missed it. As they passed the basement door, a sliver of sunlight from a high window hit the floor just right, illuminating a series of faint, almost invisible scratch marks on the hardwood, right where the new, smooth drywall met the old existing wall. Scratches that looked like they had been made by something heavy being dragged away from the wall in a hurry. His mind started working. He paused, pretending to admire a painting on the wall, and let his eyes drift back to David's office. And that's when he saw the second detail. David's desk was immaculate, polished to a high shine. But on the brass handle of a locked 2-drawer filing cabinet in the corner was a single, tiny, almost invisible smudge of white dust. The same color as the fresh paint on the basement wall. Harding didn't let his face show anything. He thanked my parents for their time, for their cooperation. He told them he understood how difficult this situation must be. He played his part just as well as they had played theirs. but as he walked out of that house and back to his car, he wasn't thinking about charging a troubled girl with a felony anymore. He was thinking about getting a search warrant. And he knew he had to move fast. I was sitting in a holding cell, the silence pressing in on me, convinced my plan had failed. Convinced I was about to be charged with a felony, that I had sacrificed everything for nothing. Then the door buzzed open and Detective Harding stood there. He didn't say a word. He just gestured for me to follow him. We walked down a long hallway to an observation room with a one-way mirror. "Watch," was all he said. Through the glass, I saw the live feed from multiple body cameras. Harding had gone back to my house. But this time he wasn't alone. He had a full forensic team and a search warrant in his hand. I watched as David opened the door, his face a mask of polite confusion that quickly crumbled into panic when he saw the warrant. The team swept through the house with a brutal efficiency. I saw them in the basement, a forensic expert running a device along the smooth, freshly painted wall of the playroom. The device beeped, a frantic, high-pitched sound. "We've got a void," the expert said. "It's a false wall." They brought in a sledgehammer, and with one powerful blow, the drywall shattered, revealing the dark, soundproofed room behind it. The quiet room, exactly as I had described it. With the heavy bolt on the outside of the door, my knees felt weak. I had to grip the counter in front of me to stay upright. It was real. They saw it. They finally saw it. Then the feed switched to David's office. They took the same sledgehammer to the locked filing cabinet, the one with the smudge of white paint dust. The metal drawers buckled, then broke open. And inside were the journals. Dozens of them. Spiral notebooks filled with the desperate, looping handwriting of scared children. The camera zoomed in on one of them. A blue notebook. Leo's. The page was filled with his clumsy, childish script. "I am unclean and I must be purified." Over and over and over, Harding turned to me then, his face grim. "We found them," he said, his voice low. "We found all of it. But that wasn't the end of it. It wasn't even the worst of it. The forensic team kept searching. And what they found next turned this from a case of psychological abuse into a waking nightmare, hidden in smoke detectors, in alarm clocks, in the eyes of teddy bears in the children's bedrooms. Were cameras. Tiny pinhole cameras, recording everything. They found one in the corner of the quiet room, angled down at the single bare mattress on the floor. My parents weren't just abusers. They weren't just monsters. They were filmmakers. They had been documenting their cruelty, recording the suffering of every child who had ever passed through their loving home. And as that horrifying reality sank in, I knew that the saints of Maple Street were about to have their halos ripped from their heads in front of the entire world. I didn't see the arrest in person. I saw it the way the rest of the world did, on the news. I was in the common room of the Juvenile Detention Center, a place that smelled like bleach and hopelessness, watching a small television bolted to the wall. And then our house appeared on the screen. News vans lined Maple Street. Neighbors I had known my whole life were gathered on their lawns, their faces masks of disbelief. The reporter was talking in a hushed, urgent tone about a house of horrors hidden in plain sight. The camera zoomed in on my school counselor, Mrs. Albright, the one who told me I was speaking in metaphors. She looked pale, horrified, shaking her head as she told the reporter, I can't believe it. They were such good people." The news cut to a shot of my parents being led from the house in handcuffs. David was silent, his face a stony mask, but Carol was still performing. "This is all a misunderstanding," she was saying to the officers, her voice shrill with indignation. "My daughter is a very troubled girl. She's made all of this up." Even then, even with the evidence of her cruelty being hauled out of her home in plastic bags, she was still playing the victim. The other kids in the common room were watching too. A girl sitting next to me, in for shoplifting, nudged my arm. "Hey, isn't that your house?" she asked. I just nodded, my eyes glued to the screen. The reporter mentioned my act of vandalism, framing it now not as a crime, but as a desperate cry for help. The girl looked from the screen to me, a new respect in her eyes. "Damn, girl," she whispered. "Was it worth it?" I didn't have an answer. The next day, Detective Harding came to see me. He didn't take me to an interrogation room. We just sat in a small, quiet office. "Well, kid," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "You were right." He told me the vandalism charges were being dropped. The mayor apparently didn't want the bad press of prosecuting the girl who exposed the biggest scandal in the city's history. He told me Leo and the other kids were safe, that they were in protective custody and were already being interviewed by specialists who knew how to talk to traumatized children. Then, he slid a thick folder across the table towards me. "We've been getting a lot of calls," he said. I opened it. Inside were the preliminary statements from the other foster kids. The ones I had named. The ones my parents had made disappear. One after another, they were telling their stories. Stories of the quiet room, of the confession journals, of the constant, soul-crushing psychological abuse. They weren't hiding anymore. They weren't scared. My scream had been heard, and now their voices were joining mine, a chorus of truth that was about to bring the saints of Maple Street crashing down to earth. I didn't go back to a normal foster home. The state placed me in a specialized therapeutic group home, a place for kids who had been through... Well, for kids like me, it was quiet, structured, and for the first time in my life, I had a therapist who actually listened. Healing wasn't a straight line. It was messy. Some days I felt strong, powerful, like the girl who had brought down the saints of Maple Street. Other days I couldn't get out of bed. The smallest thing, the click of a lock, a raised voice, could send me spiraling back into that silent, cold basement. About a month after my arrest, a letter arrived for me. It was from Leo's new social worker. Inside was a single piece of construction paper, folded in half. I opened it. It was a drawing done in crayon, in that clumsy, heartfelt way only a child can manage. It was a picture of a bird, a small, gray bird, flying out of an open cage and into a bright yellow sun. And underneath, in wobbly 8-year-old handwriting, were 3 words. Thank you, Chloe. I held that drawing for a long time, my tears splashing onto the cheap paper, blurring the crayon. It was worth it. Everything I had done, everything I had lost, it was worth it. The legal battle was long and ugly. David and Carol, with their expensive lawyers and their deep community ties, fought every single charge. They painted me as a manipulative, disturbed liar. They tried to discredit every one of the other foster kids who came forward. It was a brutal, soul-crushing process that dragged on for more than a year. But we had the truth on our side. And we had the recordings. The final scene of this chapter of my life took place in a courtroom. I was on the witness stand, and David and Carol were sitting at the defendant's table, their faces cold and unreadable. The prosecutor was asking me about the day I vandalized the mayor's car. Chloe, she said, her voice gentle but clear, do you regret what you did that day? I looked at her. Then I looked past her, to my former parents, the people who were supposed to love me, to protect me. The people who had turned my life into a prison and then tried to convince the world I was the one who was broken. I turned my gaze to the jury, to the 12 strangers who held our futures in their hands. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. I regret that I had to, I said, my voice clear and strong, without a single tremor of doubt. But I don't regret saving them. So what do you think? Was Chloe a hero, or was she a troubled kid who went too far? Sometimes the line between right and wrong isn't a line at all, but a tangled, messy knot. Let me know your verdict in the comments. And if you believe that sometimes you have to break the rules to get justice, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that challenge the way you see the world. We're just getting started.